In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a fancy flippy countdown timer in Cavalry. If you want to see a super basic version using just a simple text box, you can skip to the timecode you see on the screen now. Alright, so the first thing that we want to do in this comp is set our frame rate to 60. We're doing this because it is a time-based animation, and so 60 frames a second, 60 seconds in a minute. It just makes it a little bit easier to work with as we're doing our animations. And because this comp is at 60 frames per second, the animations for our flappy countdown will be 60 frames long as well. You can work in other frame rates if you want to, but just make sure to keep things equivalent. I'm also going to just drag on this yellow color to the background because our countdown timer will be white primarily, so this will just help us be able to see it a little bit easier. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to create a rectangle using Alt-click. We're going to rename this rectangle to upper flap. Let's set the width to 215 and the height to 150. I'm going to change the radius mode here to individual, and on these top radius I'm going to do 30. Hit Alt Enter to make that value apply to both spots. The bottom radius we'll just leave it at 5. And I'm going to go ahead and right click on the size and add it to the control center. And same thing with the top radii. Add that to the control center. The control center is a pro feature, but so are the timeline counters that this whole thing is based on. So if you don't have Pro, then you'll probably just want to stick to the simple version that's at the end of this video. Also, while I'm here, I'm going to use Control period on Windows, Command period on, I don't care. While I'm here, I'm also going to add a color array, and we will just rename this to main color. And I'm going to put color 0 into the control center as well. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect this main color to our upper flap color, and all of our flaps will be connected to here so that later on if we want to change it, it'll be super easy. So let's go ahead and I'm going to make this off-white color here, and we can close out of this main color array. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a drop shadow. We're going to rename this to main drop. Let's set the blur amount X and Y to 2. Alt Enter. And then the offset, we will set the X to 3 and the Y to -3. And I'm also going to set the alpha to 100. So now let's just connect this to our upper flap in the filters, connect to new index. Now I've got a nice drop shadow. Next, let's go ahead and create an align deformer. And this one we are going to call upper align, and we're going to set the Y to 1. So we just connect this to our upper flap into our deformers, and you see that it pushes it up here so that the pivot point is now in that bottom center. So the next thing that we'll do is we'll open up our upper flap, we'll go to deformers, and we will add a 3D matrix. And this attribute can live inside of this shape here. So let's open up our 3D matrix. We're going to set our align Y to 1, just like our align deformer. And we're going to animate the X rotation here. So starting at frame 0, and we will go to frame 60. Set that to 180. So now we see we have the top flap of our clock, and it has this nice flip animation. Let's go ahead and add an ease on here. Go to our graph editor, add Bezier handles, just something like that. So it starts out a little bit slow, speeds up on the flip, slows down at the end. Great. And now the last thing that we are going to do for this upper flap is we are also going to animate its opacity. So here in the main attributes, put a keyframe on opacity, and we're going to go to frame 30, and we're going to keep it at 100. Okay, so this flap is only going to be visible until it reaches its halfway point. One thing I'm actually going to adjust here is on this 3D matrix, I don't like that when we're right at the center that it's completely invisible, and later on when we use some masks, it'll actually mess that up. So let's go back into our graph editor and just adjust this we need to just adjust 1 point, I think. Yeah, there we go. So now there's never a frame where it's totally invisible. So now let's go back out here. So at frame 30, we are still at 100% opacity. And so then at frame 31, let's go ahead and change that to 0. And we're still going to go out to frame 60, add a keyframe here. All of the animations that I'm working on, I set these extra keyframes if needed so that they have keyframes going from 0 to 60. And this is because we're going to be driving everything with an animation control. So all of the animation lengths need to be the same number of frames, even if really this animation is only 2 frames here in the middle. Okay, so now we have our flap and we only see the top half of it and it disappears when it gets halfway. So let's clear out our attribute window. Go ahead and give it a save. All right, so next we are going to add a text layer. We're going to name this upper flap text. I want it to match the flap that it's going to be on. For the fonts and stuff, you can pick whatever you think is nice. For this example, I'm going to be using Brandon. And for now, I'm just going to put a 0 here. Let's go ahead and set this to middle alignment and middle vertical alignment as well. I'm going to use this dark gray color that I like. You can kind of use whatever you want. But this is another one where in our main color array, let's go ahead and add another color index. Put that black color here, and we can set this into the control center. So let's go back into this numbers fill and just connect it so that these are linked. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to add the font to the control center and the font size to the control center as well. Next, we can put this text inside of the upper flap shape. Oh, I forgot that we actually need to size this up. So I think this can go to 275. This text shape needs its own 3D matrix in order to work correctly. So it inherits the opacity from the parent, but it needs its own 3D matrix because this rectangle shape has different aligns on it than the text does. So in our text shape, let's go to deformers, add a 3D matrix. And then in here, we don't actually need to change anything, but what we want to do is we want to link the rotation animation from the main flap into the rotation here. So now these rotate at the same way. All right, so next what we're going to do is we are going to duplicate this upper flap and we're going to rename this to upper flap mask. We can get rid of the text and get rid of everything here. And I'm also going to delete the opacity. Let's open this up here. And so we can see that it's already connected to the main drop filter, which is unnecessary for this mask, but it's fine. We can just leave it. And it's already connected to the upper align deformer as well. So what we need to do is we need to connect the flaps 3D matrix into the mask deformers, connect to a new index here. The size and radius are the same as the bottom flap, but they're not connected to our attributes up here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the size down and pull the top radius as well. And again, this is just so that if we change it in the future, everything matches up. So what I'm going to do real quick here is go to the fill, and I'm going to disconnect this because it is a mask, so the color doesn't actually matter. I'm just going to put red here just so that we can see what we're dealing with because it's the exact same as the other flap. So let's open up the upper flap, and we're also going to parent the opacity. So we just drag this down to here. So as it flips, it then disappears at the same time as everything else. That should be everything. So now what we can do, clear those out. In our text, upper flap text, we go to our masks and we use the upper flap mask. So now we only see the top half of the number here. So what I'm going to do now is just a little bit of cleanup. So let's grab these two, the upper flap and the upper flap mask, go ahead and group them together. And we're going to call this group upper flapper. I'm also going to select all of the layers in here and we're just going to change them to purple. These layers up here, I would consider them like utilities, so I'm going to turn them red. I'm color coding these because later we're going to have a ton of different layers, and if you ever want to isolate something either in the layer panel or the viewport, you can use tags or colors for that purpose. I'll show you that later. So next what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this upper flapper and we're going to rename this to upper back. And we're going to just put this underneath the upper flapper. And just while we're here, again, I'm just going to change these colors. I'm going to just change it to blue. Okay, so in this upper back folder, we don't need the mask and we don't need any animations or anything. So we can get rid of the 3D matrices and the opacity. And here we'll actually put the text layer above the upper flap. And while I'm thinking about it, let's go ahead and update these names. So this is going to be upper back text. And this one is upper back. So let's just hide this for a second. So here you see that the number is hanging off the bottom. So what we're going to do is we are going to go into this upper back text And in the masks, we're just going to use the upper back. And we'll just turn back on the upper back layer. So we still get the same look, but it's just in a slightly different order. And this graphic doesn't need to move or anything. So that's why we got rid of all of the other animations. And make sure we don't want to forget that we have to reconnect all of these attributes. Okay, so let's turn back on this upper flapper. We do our animation and we see that it flaps and there's a background. Okay, so now we need to make the bottom flap. So let's go ahead and create another rectangle. Call this one lower back. We'll just drag it down to the bottom of the stack. Now here, in this lower back shape, our fill, we want to be that main color fill. In the shape, we want the size to be the size. And the radius, what we want to do, set this to individual. We actually want this radius to be connected to the bottom radius because it's the bottom flap. So we need to make another align deformer. And this one we will call lower align. And here in the lower align, we want our Y to be at -1. And then we will connect that to the lower back, deformers, new index. We'll also connect this main drop to the lower back and its filters. We can duplicate this upper back text shape here, drag it down. We'll rename this to lower back text. Go into our lower back text. And again, just make sure that everything is connected. The fill is the same. So this mask, just get rid of this because we don't want it masked to the top. We'll just use the lower back as a mask. Turn this back on and we can group these two, call it lower back. And again, we're going to just color code these. Next, let's select this lower back layer and we will just duplicate that. So this folder we will call lower flapper, and I've recolored it to this lighter green color. Let's rename this one to lower flap text, and this one will be lower flap. Now basically what we want to do is we want to just recreate the same upper flapper, except change a couple of things. And so here is where it can be good to use our color tag system. If I press this button, open this up, what I can do is I want to look at the green layers and the purple layers. So I can click on purple and then control or command click on lime, or no, not lime, sorry, we want green. Okay, so now we see only the purple and green layers. Okay, so in this lower flapper, let's go to the lower flap text, go to masks, delete that mask, because in the upper flapper, we had to create a separate mask. We can go ahead and nest the text inside of the lower flap shape. In our lower flap, we need to go to deformers and we need to add a 3D matrix. Okay, so this lower flap 3D matrix in here, we want our Y to be -1, the same as the alignment for the lower flap. We want our X rotation to be keyframed from 0 to 60. It's going to be 0 at 60, -180 at 0. You'll see here, it flaps along with the top flap. Basically the same animation. Right now the easing is off because it's just the default easing, which is why you can kind of see two here. So what we can do is in the upper flap in the 3D matrix, open that up. If we select these keyframes, right click, and then do copy easing, and then select these keyframes and hit Control or Command V, now their easing are exactly the same. So now we need to add a 3D matrix to the bottom flap text. Go to Deformers, 3D matrix. Now in this 3D matrix, we can keep everything the same, and then we just want to connect the lower flaps rotation to the text rotation. So now, as this moves, you see that the 0 flaps along with it. So now this text needs a mask, just like we did for the top one. So let's go ahead and duplicate this lower flap, and we can get rid of almost everything. So let's get rid of the lower flap text. And in our 3D matrix here, we can delete that rotation. Let's rename this to lower flap mask. And in this 3D matrix, again, just like the top flap, we will copy or link the rotation from the lower flaps 3D matrix to the flap masks 3D matrix. So now the mask animates the same. So now let's open up the lower flap layer, open up our lower flap text, go to our mask, and we'll just drag in our lower flap mask, and there we go. So now the final thing to do is we want the opacity to be the same but reverse as the upper flap. So what we can do here is on this upper flap, we will just Control or Command C, copy the opacity. And then if we go down to our lower flap, we will just have this selected and hit Control V, and now we have the thing. So right now it's the same exact opacity as the top, which is not what we want. We want the reverse. So we can select these keyframes, go up to Animation, and then Reverse Animation. So now it pops in for the bottom part. So now we can turn back on the upper flapper, and we'll see that we have a nice flap that's totally seamless, even though it is two different elements. So now the reason that I recreated this entire lower flap instead of just duplicating the top and sort of recreating it almost exactly the same is because with this top flap, you can see that everything is pointing up nicely. And then when it does its 3D transform, this number would actually be upside down. And when you're dealing with some of the things that come later, like the transforms just kind of looked weird and it makes things a little bit complicated. So by recreating it here, where this is actually the natural default state of this bottom one. So everything is, facing up. There's no weird 3D transforms on it right now because this is its base state. So here, this upper flap is in its base regular state. And then it switches over, and now this bottom flap is in its own base regular state. And what we can do is we can just hit this little X here. So now we see all of our layers again. Let's go ahead and hide that, clear that. We have an upper flapper, an upper back. We have a lower flapper and a lower back. So if we look at this animation, we see a nice flap animation. So this is all of the layers that we need to create for this counter animation. There's still some utility stuff that we need, like the timeline counters. So let's get into that. The rightmost digit is the 1 second place, right? So every second it changes 98765432210. And this is actually the easiest one to set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a timeline counter. We are going to create a number range, and we are going to create an animation control. And just to keep things a little bit tidy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select our red layers here. We're going to group that, and we're going to name this utilities. And then we also want this folder color to be red so that this all matches. And then these top ones can also be red, but they're going to go into a separate folder that we're just going to call timeline utilities. And then the next thing that we want to do is down here, this button here turns on the beat markers. And so if we open it up, we see that the beats per minute is 60, the offset is 0, and the beats per bar is 4. I don't know if this is the default or if it's just that way because I've already kind of built this file before, but these are the settings that we want for our composition. And again, it's because we are at 60 frames a second, keeping everything on the 60s. If you're using a different frame rate, then you may have to adjust this so that the bars line up every second of animation. I'm going to update this to be timeline flapper. Okay, so let's explain what a timeline counter does. So these are the default settings, and we will come back to accumulate and time markers. But for now, we want to set the count target to beat markers. We want to set the count mode to trigger. We're going to change these attributes in a second, but I'm going to leave them default for now. So you can see here in our count, the value is 0. And so by default, on beat markers and trigger, this will be 0 until you hit one of these beat marker lines. When you hit the line, you'll see it goes to 1 and then immediately back down to 0. So if we look at this convolution graph, basically what this is saying is that, okay, we're here at 1 and we're all the way up at the top, we're doing 1 and then we're back to 0, right? If we change the convolution size, so let's say that that is 20, okay? What that means is that there is a window of 20 frames with the beat marker at the center. So once we get to frame 50, you'll see that 51, we start to get a value here. And so basically this graph, you can think of this as frame 50 and this as frame 70 with 60 right in the middle. And if you were to look at this beat graph at 120, then this would be 110, this would be 120, and this would be 130. Basically, by default, if you have a convolution size, this middle point in the graph will be the beat marker. And then these points will be at half of whatever the convolution size is on either end. And this graph is saying that we want to start at 0, go up to 1 at the midpoint, which again by default is this line, and then we continue and we drop back down to 0. So by default, you get a little up and then down. So if you were to put this onto as an example, if we make a circle here, if we were to connect the timeline flapper output to the Y, and let's just quickly put an expression here to just say, like times 5, just so that we can see it. So, oops, not x5, times 5, okay. So as we are, let's actually make that by times 100. Okay. So we can see here that at frame 50, right, we're just entering the graph. At frame 60, we are all the way up at 100 because our expression says times 100, and up at the top is 1, right? And then it comes back down until frame 70, where we are back at 0. So that's how this kind of goes. And if we change, let's get rid of that for a second. If we change the convolution size to 40, then what that means is that at 60, where our beat marker is, if we go backwards 20, so frame 40 is when this animation will start to take effect. Okay? And so you can see that every time it gets to 20 frames before or after a beat marker, it starts to animate and do its thing. Now the offset, right, with an offset of 0, it's basically saying that the beat marker is the center. But if we were to say the offset is 40, right, then if we go here to 60, right, this is where our beat marker is, and 60 is now where it started because we've offset it by the amount of the window. So it's going to go up, and then here at 80 it reaches its peak, right, so that's 20 frames later, right? So again, it just kind of shifted it. So this is 60, this is 80, and then this is 100, right? So you can shift where this graph takes place in relation to the beat markers. Now, I'm gonna delete this for now. With our animation, we know that we've set it up to go from 0 to 60. So we want the window size to be 60, and we want the offset to be minus 30. So the reason that I do that is that if the offset was 0, then the graph here would start at 30, be at its maximum at 60, and then go back down at 90. But we want the flips to be on the second, right? So instead of starting at 30, we want to push it back another 30. So we're actually starting at 0. And so then this is now 0 with the right side being 60. And at 60 is another beat marker. So it just repeats. Now the other thing that we want is that we don't want the animation to kind of go forward and then go backwards, which is what this would do. So we want to set this to a straight line from the bottom left to the top right. And because we're going to be plugging it into an animation control, that's saying start your animation at 0 and evenly go to 100% of the animation over 0 to 60. Okay, so let's get things connected so we can actually see it in practice. Our number range, let's rename this to flapper range. We are going to set the source minimum 0. The source maximum is going to be 1. Right? A timeline counter will only ever give you values from 0 to 1. This value is the value from the timeline flapper. And then we want to leave this at 0 to 100. Next, we want to take the output of the number range, our flapper range, and pipe that into the animation control's amount. We go to our animation control, and we don't really need to change anything here. Okay, so now what we can do is, before things are connected to the animation, we can look at the numbers here. So we are starting at 1 because there is a beat marker here. Okay, and then we're going, and we see that this is actually moving backwards, right? So it's going from 100% of the animation down to 0 and then restarting. So all we need to do is, in our number range, our flapper range, go to the graph and then click this button to reverse it. So now when we look at the values, we are starting at 0 and we are moving all the way up to 100 and then restarting. Okay, so now let's connect that to anything that has an animation, and so that we can actually see it in action. So if we go to our upper flapper, we see that there's opacity here and our 3D matrix here. So let's take our animation control. We're going to connect it to the opacity, and you'll see that it's connected by this little dash here. Animation control to this 3D matrix rotation. Close that. Upper back doesn't have any animation. Lower flapper, it's the same things. So the animation to the opacity and the animation control to the rotation X on that 3D matrix. We see that it flaps, and when it gets to this next beat marker, it flaps again. And so now we have infinite flaps as long as there are beat markers. The timeline flapper is looking at the beat markers. It is sending a value from 0 to 1 to our number range, which is converting it from 0 to 1 to 0 to 100. We are pushing that through an animation control, so moving the animation control from 0% to 100%, and connecting our animation control to anything that has animations so that it drives the animation dynamically. So the next step is to make it so that the numbers change dynamically. In our timeline utilities, what we're going to do is we want 2 string generators and 2 value arrays. So let's start with the string generators. String generator. I'm going to move that into our timeline utilities, change its color to red, and this one we will call primary digits. And then we're going to duplicate that, and we're going to call this one hidden digits. In both of these, we want the precision to be 0 and the padding to be 0 as well. In our primary digits, on the number, right click and add an array, a value array. We're going to rename this one to primary digits array. And then in our hidden digits, we're going to do the same thing. On number, right click, add array, value array. Rename this to hidden digits array. And make sure that both of these are red. In our primary digits array, this is the ones, seconds place in the counter. So we want this to count down from 0, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we're going to add 9 indexes here to make 10 total. And in our primary digits array, we want the order to be 1, 0, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and 2. And in our hidden digits array, same thing, except we want the order to be 0, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The reason that we want to do them in this order, 2 reasons. So first, let's look at the primary digits. We start at 1, and then 0, and then 9, which sounds weird. But if we look at our timeline flapper, it starts at 1. And if we set this to accumulate, it would also start at 1, which we will do that in a second. And that is because there is a beat marker on frame 0. So it will start with the value of 1, but arrays in Cavalry start at 0. So it'll be looking at actually the second value in the array. And so if we go down to our primary digits array, the second value, right, it says 1, but it's the second value, is 0, which is the first digit that we want to see. And we want it to start at 0 just because as you're actually counting the true seconds, it lines up better and it makes a little bit more sense if you start at 0, right? Because 0 is sort of like 10. So let's get things connected. So our primary digits generator will be connected to the lower back text, and and the upper flapper text. So let's go to lower back text. We can just drag a connection from the primary digits here and put it to the string. And then the upper flapper text is in here. Okay, so same thing, you just put that here. The hidden digits, we want to connect that generator to the upper back text and the lower flapper text. So let's go to our lower flapper, and we have our text here. So our hidden digits generator, lower flap text, string, and our upper back text. So here, this one, so hidden digits, upper back text, string. When we look at this, we have 1 and 0, right? These numbers don't make sense just yet because we still need to actually add the timeline counter that does accumulate. Right now, it's just showing the first index 0 for both. So right, so primary is 1 and then the hidden is 0. So these numbers don't make sense just yet. So in our timeline utilities, we're going to add another timeline counter. We're going to set this to red. We're going to change the name to timeline numbers. And in this one, we want our count target to be beat markers again, but we want this to be accumulate. So we're going to leave these at 0. And the graph, I don't think it matters, but I'm just going to set it here just because. So now if we look at this one, as we go over the beat markers, you just see it's adding up here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So now if we go back to our arrays, our primary and our hidden, we can connect the timeline numbers to the array index of both. We see that as it flips, we go 0, 9, 8, 7, 6, right? So it's exactly what we want to see. To show it better, because we're running out of space here, let's go into our comp settings and just change this to 720. Open everything up, Control A, let's go down here, Alt, drag. Sometimes I don't really understand how it chooses which layers to drag or not. But now we can close everything back up. Now you'll see that currently in version 1.4, there is a little bit of weirdness with the timeline. So you can see that as I drag the frames over here, it kind of shifted the view over, and now we're losing our first frames and we don't know what to do here. So if that happens to you, all you need to do is just go to a different comp and then go back and it'll be reset. And so if we look at this, we go 0, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then back to 2 and 1 and back to 2 and 1. Okay, so what's going on here? That's not helpful, right? So basically, if we look at our arrays, let's keep one array up and we will also look at our timeline number. We can see here that this count is 2 and this array index is also 2. And as we keep going and we start to get that weird glitch, we see that this count is at 11 and the array index is also at 11, but we do not have 11 entries in this array. So it's basically just staying on 2. If you want to loop an array, what you need to do is add an expression on the array index. That expression is going to be the %, and then the amount of indexes that we have. And so even though this last number is 9, because of arrays starting at 0, there's actually 10 values here. So we're going to say %, 10. And so what does that mean? The % in this context means modulo. Modulo 10 means that it's going to count up, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But then as soon as it were to hit 10, instead of hitting 10, it will loop back down to 0. And so it will make that number never reach 10, which again, even though there's 10 entries here, this is actually the 9th value, right? So it goes up to 9 and then it loops back down to 0. So now we see this one, it goes back to 0 and 1, 2, 3. So even though this says 12, this is at 2, right? And so now we need to go back to our hidden digits. So we've added the modulo to our primary. So let's go to our hidden digits. And it's just the exact same thing. Go to add expression, %, 10, modulo 10. So now if we come here to 600, we see that it gets to 1, and then it loops back to 0, and then 9, 8, right? And so now it'll just keep going. And this is a 10-second flap counter that will loop after 10 seconds. So that's super cool. But we still need, the other seconds digit and a minutes digit or an hours, like however many you want to do. So let's go ahead and do that. What we're going to do is we're going to take all of these folders, group them, and I'm just going to call this the 1S digit. In this folder, I'm going to just move it all the way over here, just so that we have space. Go ahead and duplicate this, and on this one, recenter that, and we will call this the 10S digit. Right, so this is the tens digit. If we were to just play, it's going to do exactly the same thing. So for this project, since I'm making a time counter, this tens digit is not going to go from 9 to 0. It's actually going to go from 5, right? So let's open up our value arrays, and we are going to delete the values of 9 through 6. Okay, so we're just going to delete those attributes, go to our hidden array, and same thing, delete 9 through 6. So now if we scroll through here, it'll be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Oh, okay, so see, this is actually, it's giving us a glitch again. And the reason that it's doing that is because we changed the amount of entries in this array. So we also need to update the expression. So this is going to be mod 6, and down here, same thing, mod 6. So now, when we go through 0, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. So that is working correctly, except that it's still flipping every second. This is where we are going to move away from using beat markers, because you can only have, currently in the 1.4 build, one set of beat markers per timeline. So what we need to do is we need to add custom time markers. To make this example easier to visualize, let's go back to our comp settings, and we are actually going to change this to 7,200, which comes out to 2 minutes if you are working in a 60 frames per second comp. So what we're going to do is in the timeline numbers, we are going to set this to time markers, and we're going to leave everything else the same because we want it to act the same. Just do it at a different frequency, which will be controlled by the time markers. And so the timeline flapper one is also going to go to time markers. Now down here, we want to filter marker color on both of them, and we're going to leave it as blue. And the reason that we're filtering it is because we are going to add at least one more digit in the minutes column. And so that'll be a different color. So instead of just looking at any time markers, we want to look at a specific color. Now, this is where things get super tedious. If you want this to flap once every 10 seconds, that means that you need to create a time marker every 600 frames. So we will start with one at 0. So you can right click, add time marker, and then we double click on it. It does default to blue, so we don't really need to change anything else here. We see that something is wrong. So let's double click on here, and we see that the absolute time is -18. I don't really know why it put it at -18, but we can just set that to 0. Okay, so it's at 0, so it starts out, it does the one flip, but you can see our seconds flapper is going, and our other flapper never flaps again. We can now go to 600, right? Because that is going to be 60 times 10, right? So we're at 0, and we want it to flap along with that one. So, right click, add a time marker, double click on it, make sure that it's 600, it's blue. Okay, so now we're here, and it flaps again. And oh my goodness, this is tedious. What if we're doing this for 10 minutes, right? That's crazy. So that's why I made a little plugin here. It's called Batch Markers, and it's free. It's a pay what you want plugin on aescripts.com, but it is free. And there's a link for that in the description below. Definitely download that and use it if you're going to be doing projects like this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just right click, and I'm going to delete all time markers. And what I can do up here is I can pick the amount of markers, the frames between markers, the starting frame, what the color is, what the name of the marker is. For this example, we want a marker every 10 seconds. So the frames between markers is going to be 600 frames. We want it to start at 0. And for this example of 2 minutes, so we can set the plugin to create 12 markers, 600 frames apart, starting at 0. So let's set this to 12. Now remember, we set the marker color that these are looking for to be blue. So we want the color to be blue. And we don't really need a name. The name is optional. But just to kind of keep things tidy, we will just name the markers 10s digit. Now we create our markers and boom, there's all of our markers at the proper times. So we can just verify this, 3, 2, 1, 0, and then on the 0 flip, 4, 9, you'll see that is 2 minutes, right? Just 59 seconds twice. So that is the tens digit taken care of. Before we move on, what we'll do is we'll just add the other markers as well. For this project, the minutes time markers would be easy to add by hand because there's only 2 of them. And the other thing that I'll show you is that if you don't use the plugin, you can use Control or Command star, and that does actually add default time marker. I'm still going to delete this one. So with this one selected, you can hit delete and just delete that single one. I'm still going to use the plugin though. So we want 2 markers, and they're going to be 3600 apart, and we want it to start on frame 0. And I'm going to do these ones as gold. So we create our time markers, and you see we have a gold one here and a gold one here, and it doesn't affect our minutes because our minutes, or our 10 seconds is looking at the blue markers, and our 1 seconds are looking at these beat markers. And as a side note, if you get sick of seeing them down here, you can just press this button to turn them off, but they still exist. So your seconds will still work. So now this is basically exactly the same as the 10-second one. So we will just duplicate this. On our 10-second, we'll just move that out of the way. Let's just call it 1M flapper, or digit, right? Keep it consistent. And we need to kind of do basically the same thing that we did last time. So our timeline numbers, we are looking at time markers to accumulate, but we want gold. And our timeline flapper is also going to be the exact same, except it's going to be gold. So in our arrays, we want to get rid of 5, 4, and 3. And here, 5, 4, 3. So here, it starts on 0 and it goes to 2, which is actually incorrect, right? Like we want it to start at 2 and end on 0. So on the primary, we will select our first value, the 1 value, and just send it to the bottom. And then on our hidden digits, we will select the 0 and reorder move index to the bottom. And so then it goes 2, and then go down to 1, and then to 0, and that is the end of the comp. So let's just add some dots real quick. We will just get this centered. You can turn on your comp grids here, and that will help you kind of center things up. We have our clock. Okay, so if you want just a simple text countdown that's nothing fancy like the flippers that we just made, it's actually pretty simple. So what you can do is start with a text shape. We're just going to throw on white. You can set the font to whatever you want. I'm not really going to bother with that right now. I'll just make it bigger so we can see. In our string, click on this little plus and do string generator. Okay. In here, you're going to change this to timecode, and you'll see that by default counts up. Now, what's important is to know what your frame rate is. So my comp's default at 24. You could use 60. You could use whatever you want. Doesn't really matter. You just need to know what the frame rate is. So for this example, I'm going to just set this to 60. And for a 5-minute timer, you're going to want 18,000 frames. Okay, so in the string generator, you're going to disconnect this frame node because you don't want it to be counting up from the frames, right? So we'll disconnect that and right click, and then you can add a behavior, or actually add math. So you're going to add a math node. In this math node, the first number that you want is the total amount of frames, which we just said was 18,000. Okay, and then you're going to subtract the frame. So here on the second value, you can right click, add behavior, frame. So now it's going to take the frame in here and subtract it from your final, which is 5 minutes, and that just makes it count down. And so that's just a real-time counting down timer based on the amount of frames in your comp. You might not want all of these digits because like who actually wants all of those digits? So what you can do is in your string generator, you're going to add a manipulator and set it to resize string. Okay. Now just kind of move this up until you get you're moving this up and you're basically deleting the digits on the right. So I'm going to move it to here, and then you just duplicate this. And then in the second one, you just click erase from start. If you duplicate it, you still need to actually like reconnect it. So just connect that back in to a new index. And so now you can see that you can cut off whatever you want. And you've got yourself a super quick timer that you can format however you want using just text. So that is it for the fancy flappy countdown timer or the simple text-based timer. Comment down below what you want me to make my next tutorial on, or if you have a question about this setup, and like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.